All right, everybody. Hey, what's up? You know who this is by now. Brandon Buchanan, typically of Not Safe for Wonks. Now I'm just freelancing, and who knows? You just see me on the streets. Um, Today, we've got a very special dark panelists that I love, panelists that you love, and we want to talk about like representation of police in media, which I think will maybe be like some of it is super absurd, and we'll have fun like talking about some of the absurdities here. But just like everything else in our culture, like the absurdity is mixed in with like some real stuff that we've got to dive in and go through. So let's start bringing people on. I want to talk to Asia Arnold, Mainline Magazine, one of our panelists. Asia, this is like our first time hanging out in public. I know you from just being a consumer of some of your work. You guys do very good like long form audio and very good long form journalism, like the kind of stuff that like papers like Creative Loafing used to have before they like had what happened to them happen to them. So
Yeah.
how are you? How's it going?
What was that?
Oh, just Creative Loafing was doing their thing, and then what happened happened.
Right.
Yeah. But how's it going?
It's going good. I mean, I really appreciate the positive feedback and the support. I think this work is all about, just being in the work regardless of, instant results. It's a long road, so I'm just grateful that we're having an impact in our communities. And I was at Creative Loafing briefly, kind of at the crux of that time. I know exactly what you're talking about, so it's cool to see that's coming to fruition for the Mainline. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Deja Woolery, Deja Talks TV, really exciting channel. It's very great to finally hang out with you like these are a lot of first time meetings. Deja, how's it going?
It's going good. Yeah, I'm having a great time getting to use TikTok of all platforms to talk about TV and media, and I'm just happy to be here and have this conversation.
Absolutely. Nolan Huber Rhodes, I would just consider you like an extremely smart guy. You do a lot of very important academic research. You just are a wealth of knowledge. You're a font of knowledge. Nolan, how's it going?
It's going well. I am really excited to be here, excited to be a part of DARC. I've been organizing with DARC for a few months, and this is, it's really exciting to be a part of this organization and to kind of represent our organization tonight.
When we talk about police and media, like as soon as people like invited me to come and talk, the first thing I thought about was cops. And like, it's the most unsubtle when we talk about like representation of police and media that I feel like, I talk to like older Black folks and they kind of hew right on criminal justice, partially because they watched Cops for the last 20 years. Like, people don't know what a incredibly popular long running show Cops like was. So Deja, can you talk about how Cops influenced the way that the public thinks and talks about crime in America?
Yeah, absolutely. Cops actually comes from like a super long running tradition. I think the first show like it to have this sort of reality view of police was a Kansas-based show, ironically called Law and Order. And that was, so many decades ago, right? But it's still affecting the way that we do TV today. And Cops had an incredibly long runtime with such a, like you said, it's almost ridiculous, such a ridiculous formula and such ridiculous things you see on screen. They're driving, they get a call, they're driving and talking about how great they are at being cops and this neighborhood's gone to hell. And of course they're in like often Black and brown neighborhoods. They get a call, they tackle someone. It keeps going through this cycle for an episode and then a season and then years. And I think one of the things when I watch it that sticks out to me about like how hard to untangle this web is the way that the cops act. Because they act like the cops. They act like they've been watching Law and Order and they've been watching Criminal Minds and they feel like that and they're on camera and they start acting in that role. And it's just so obvious watching it that like we can't unstick media and reality when it comes to policing because it's all tangled in. It's been around long enough to affect the people who are now going into those jobs as cops,
Deja, the cops on cops are not good cops. Like, I don't know when the last time it was that y'all like saw an episode of Cops, but like they are frequently like tripping on people who, once in a while you see like a domestic abuse situation, and that's horrible. But more often than not, when you watch Cops, like literally, it's like somebody's drunk and disorderly, and like these guys are just jerks to this person who's drunk or whatever. And then they drive and act like, man, we really cleaned up the world today. I guess it is kind of like, in a lot of ways, it's one of the earliest reality TV shows, like in the sense of kind of packaging salacious human misery, like people at their worst time and their worst moment, and packaging that to people. And if you think about like the images that we saw of so many people, and our images and preconceptions of crime are like human beings just at their absolute worst moment. And that's a bummer. So listen, obviously Cops is the biggest, broadest, most like ridiculous form of, police and media. But I think there's other stuff that's maybe more subtle that still has like a long-ranging impact. And so many of these popular shows, Law and Order, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Paw Patrol, are they cops on Paw Patrol? Deja, I see that you're not fully. What should we think about the cops on Paw Patrol?
I feel like Law and Order, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and Paw Patrol are like the three big things that I see in like policing media, which I would put. I have to write it down because I know I'd forget. But reality, hilarity, and simplicity. So, shows like Law and Order, they want you to think this is real. And so they have to accept a certain level of like grit and darkness in a gray area. But it's actually just like cops being terrible a lot of the times. And then you have Brooklyn Nine-Nine that tries to make you laugh while you're watching it, to the point where you ask a lot of people who enjoy shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine and Reno 911, like a plot of one of the crimes, and they might not remember it, but they remember, what the characters were doing and like the fun things they were, going through. And then you have Paw Patrol, which it just sounds so like crazy that it even has to be a part of this conversation. But there's like an invasiveness that's really weird in just the idea of showing kids this, where it's like, yeah, they're not going to show a crime on Paw Patrol, but every aspect of your life is called the Paw Patrol. And the police within that are given this like unending purview, but they're also unendingly good. So instead in Paw Patrol, it's all simple. It's, the restaurant owner needs more pizzas and they're going to call the Paw Patrol, and your car breaks down and they're going to call the Paw Patrol. And we do live in a reality with really invasive policing. And it's strange to think about like how quickly a kid can get the idea like, yes, any aspect of my life, the police has some purview in it. But yeah, I would put them in like reality, hilarity, and simplicity is kind of the ways that a lot of copaganda shows try and go about it.
Well, Nolan, you are somebody that researches that intersection between narrative and public policy. I mean, you research some of the paradigms that are used to justify policing in prisons. So can you give us like an example of how some of those narratives and stories come up and pop up?
Yeah, I mean, I think you see them most pointedly in some of the shows that we talked about. But I really like that you broke it down, Deja, into reality, hilarity, and simplicity. Ultimately, all of these things are used to normalize and celebrate police. To normalize and celebrate police. It's almost like a form of gaslighting, if you will, because it's so different than the lived realities that people go through, especially the lived realities of Black and brown communities and poor communities who get terrorized by police. And so it really is almost a form of gaslighting in how they do it. But the way that we like human beings function psychologically, like we create these meta narratives in our brains that like every story that we hear has to fit into these boxes of meta narratives. Like we are storied beings, like we make sense of all of our reality through story. And so when we hear these stories of police, and we are inundated with these stories of police from propaganda, we put them into these boxes in our brains that we already have. So police are good, police are heroes. And you see this, I mean, starting as early as Paw Patrol, and it's just, we're inundated with it. And until we are given like different narrative boxes to put the stories through which we experience policing in, then all we ever get is a reproduction of policing, if you will.
Well, when you talk about narrative, are you talking about narrative in terms of the media? Are you talking about narrative in terms of literal, like, more fiction creators? Are you talking more about like the political range of views that are tolerated on major media networks and like independent? Like, what do you think is the main thrust? Like, where's the main battlefield that is being fought?
I don't know that there's necessarily a main battlefield. I think narrative is how we experience life. Like, human beings are narrative beings where we hear stories that build narratives that construct our realities. And the realities that we live in are ones that, I mean, police are everywhere in. And they're the solution to so many different problems. So I'm not sure that there's like one main battlefield. You know, we can talk about these like very specific parts of copaganda, but like also these superhero movies and stuff like that also reinforce these narratives that cops or that somebody has to protect us from those bad people.
Sure. Let me kick this over to Asia. Why do you think that so many Americans, you know, view police officers as heroes? Is this like the result of a propaganda effort? Does the media contribute? And does that kind of contribution change maybe depending on the media? Just kick that question around. How does the media contribute to these narratives?
In so many ways. I'm going to try and tackle this and as like concretely and concisely as I can. I need to pick up on what Deja was saying about how police are viewed in like Hollywood and in media. There's a really long history to that dates like really into the like early 1900s and like 1920s and 30s in Hollywood. And there's like this whole deal between like filmmakers and police have been like written into Hollywood deals and they benefit off of it. So there's that. And then as Nolan was talking, I was thinking about the concept of hypernormalization when you're talking about narratives. And the Mainline, we just did a podcast report on it, or we had a whole discussion about hypernormalization, but a short definition of what that is essentially politicians and institutions and corporations, instead of telling a real, more complex narrative that is accurately true, they opt for a simpler narrative and continue to like feed that to the public, right? And the origins of that are from like the end of the USSR, super dark time. That's on our To the Left podcast if anyone is interested. I think one thing to consider though is like, because Nolan was kind of alluding to this, that there's all these different iterations of it, but when we're talking about, and I can keep the focus on, you know, news systems, like US media systems and the news and journalism, right? We have to consider the history of that industry, which is, you know, the US media systems were installed to uphold a white power structure. So anything that you see coming out of that is going to be symptomatic of that original base and that structure, right? And these depictions of, you know, cops is just one symptom of it. And, you know, I think it's DARC. Some of you all were introducing to this term, you know, they're the gentrifier protecting, or I can't remember, Brandon, you might have to fill it in for me, but they're kind of like the bottom of the barrel, right? Like cops are really just like protecting such a bigger power structure. That's why it's so, and you know, recent studies show that only 21% of Americans have had recent interactions with the cops. So, but we all have an opinion about what cops are. And it's like, I encourage anyone, especially white people, to kind of look at those preconceived notions of cops and how they're shaped and molded through shows like I grew up watching Law and Order and Law and Order SVU, for example, and then we can get into more about this, but
I want to get into it. I want to ask Deja because like CSI, Law and Order, shows like that do present an image of law enforcement that maybe clashes with like the majority of people who like interact with cops and get like no answers when they need something. They call and they get put on hold and nobody calls them back. There aren't any TV episodes that are like that, right? What effect has this portrayal? And we can say that it's copaganda. We can say that it's just fitting a narrative structure format that you can play commercials over with, 3 times in an hour, regardless of like, just storytelling in general can be unrealistically flattering. So that has had, I think, an impact on how people think about policing and how people think of them as like an incredibly competent group. When we see so many stories of like mistakes or things falling through the cracks and things like that. So Deja, can you just talk a little bit about that effect? And you've done research on, the plot lines of a lot of these shows as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I had to laugh for a second because he said like, they get a call and they just kind of solve the crime, and you don't see
Right.
reality where a lot of times people make a call and they don't get help. And I always
Right.
have to laugh imagining that episode that just cuts to the credits like, hey, nothing happened. But yeah, I watched a lot of cop shows for years and years. And honestly, I think that's part of why at this point I'm very far from any interest in police.
Yeah, I was gonna say, did it make you have a soft spot for these shows, or did you dislike them more because you were looking at the strings?
It was. I think Nolan was spot on to call it like a sort of gaslighting, because I would watch it and there's a narrative structure to it that's really addicting. But I was also like, this is so fake. This is not in any way connecting to the sort of reality I experience. But like I said, they have this narrative structure that can be addicting, and part of it is incredible repetition. And so I took 5 shows. I took Psych, Bones, Criminal Minds, SVU, and Monk, trying to get the gambit of the sort of shows. And I wrote a list of 17 plots off the top of my head that I'm like, these are constantly in cop shows. And I found at least one episode for like all the plots that I wrote for most of the shows. So I found about like 80 episodes that fit these plots. And ones that all of them had were a wrongful conviction episode, episodes set in a prison, episodes where they break jurisdiction because they can, and dirty cops. And it seems, why would these shows include something like dirty cops? But then we're like, oh, but they're kind of propaganda. Well, it's really easy to have a dirty cop episode and go, thank God we got rid of that guy. Thank God the rest of our system's not like that. And so even in an attempt to acknowledge the darkness, they have to make them bad apples, because if they acknowledge the root of the issue, then you have to start looking at your protagonist really differently. Right.
I mean, whenever there's like a systemic issue of police corruption being addressed, it's usually, the antagonist, that person that's getting in the way of the action and the fun, human internal affairs. The IA is always like the nerd that's holding up like the cool stuff that you came and tuned in to watch the show for. So funnily enough, you can imagine like people rolling their eyes whenever internal affairs gets brought up on the news, because they're known as the people that stop the fun. It's messed up. It's rough.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Because I think that is so awesome that you did that research. And one thing that, again, like I said, I grew up on like Law and Order, SVU, but I think one of these narratives is that whenever cops are breaking the rules, it's because they have to get the bad guy. It's like a sacrifice that they're making. So it's like, I'm willing to break jurisdiction if it means I can get a murderer off the street. So it's still, even when they're breaking the rules, it fits this narrative that they're like the hero.
Can I just kind of connect this back to some of the larger parts of that we were already talking about? Is like, if our brains have this meta narrative of cops, that cops are heroes, then when we hear of a cop doing something bad, our brains need that to fit. Unless we have a broader narrative, our brains naturally as human beings need that to fit into the meta narrative that cops are heroes. And so our brains, whether cops tell us that it's this way or not, our brains naturally need to fit a bad cop into a bad apple narrative. Right. And that's why I think we're gaining so much traction because there are now counter narratives. We've got a cop, like all cops are bastards, all cops are bad. We've got new narratives that people have that they can start shifting these stories of bad cops into those new boxes.
Sure. Listen, Asia, I want to talk to you just about, because when we talk about changing the narratives, I feel like you're a person that's been on the front lines of trying to do that. I know that you've come through a lot of police statements in your last couple of years. And, you know, these statements are often quoted by people who are in the media and in positions of authority. And you see phrases like officer involved shooting that are very vague, or like emotionally disturbed person. So how is it, what are the tools that an average person needs in order to like read an article like that that's written by somebody that, like, honestly, is just a tired person trying to make ends meet, and they're copying from the piece of paper or whatever? What does the average person need to do in order to maybe be able to decode that kind of language in their media that they consume?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, an average person could, you know, we're in control of what news we consume at a certain level, right? I mean, the masses of Americans are, I think Americans are one of the most propagated populations in the world, but we don't want to do that. So one thing that you can do is to begin to read more progressive news outlets, like non-corporate news. Mainline is an Atlanta news source, but beyond that, I read Common Dreams, for example, was one of the first progressive outlets I started to read. The Intercept, Columbia Review is a really good one. Do y'all like The Intercept? I don't know what that reaction was.
Boy, you know, well, here's the thing. Glenn is very good friends with one of my buddies locally. So, you know, he looks the other way for some of Glenn's more wild takes because they get along.
Sure.
But The Intercept has been like a source for quality journalism for many years, just as a matter of fact.
Right. So, I just want to finish like answering because you touched on a couple of things like those phrases that you mentioned. Certain things to look out for is like passive language when talking about police brutality, right? So one thing that we focus on in the Mainline is something called media reparations, which is, we've never seen a conversation on a national level about media reparations before. That is spearheaded by Media 2070. So that means that, you know, I personally, when it comes to objectivism and impartiality, cops are known to lie. So they're not really reliable sources. It's very systemic, the way that journalists are taught and trained to look towards police as the final word on things. And just in the last week in my reporting, you know, in the Vincent Truitt case, Cobb County Police Chief there, he lied twice in a statement. And the danger with that is he lied about certain things that are on video of that police shooting of Vincent Truitt, who was 17 years old, shot twice in the back. He lied about him pointing his gun, which he didn't, and he lied about him being a driver in a stolen vehicle, which he wasn't. And a lot of people aren't going to watch that video because it's sensitive material and news doesn't really show it in that way. So that's really damaging to this, really the truth of what is happening when it comes to police brutality against Black Americans. And that passive language, we saw it with, James Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, CBS 46 in Atlanta did a report, but they totally omitted. There are 3 different ways to be dishonest, right? And one of those is being lies of omission. And they completely omitted details about James Blake's police shooting, in which they shot him 7 times in the back in front of his children and left him paralyzed and handcuffed. They detained him and handcuffed him in the hospital. So I called that out at the time because it's like, hey, if, you know, reporters would make it a practice and it wouldn't be so astounding to the general public why people are taking to the streets about police brutality.
Deja and Nolan, listen, when it comes to, you know, reporting on crime, I think that cops get spoken of in a completely different way in the reporting than people who get arrested. I think that when somebody who is maybe like that situation that we just saw, you know, shot all those times in the back, like on video, the counter narrative that came up, like against this person, even in the hours after all of that had gone down, was jaw dropping. I thought this is not like fair and level treatment in the media. And I think it also differs when it comes to race. I think it differs when it comes to class. And that can be like the race of the cop and the race of the person that's affected. All of that, Deja and or Nolan, have y'all seen, you know, ties between those? Asia, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I'm just, processing all the elements of the question. As you started talking about representation, my first thought is, I being media brained and all that.
Right.
Just in TV shows, they cannot figure out how to get representation until they are then they're like, we have got to get Shamar Moore, we have got to get Ice-T, we need
Shamar
in here to make sure this doesn't look bad. And I definitely think that's a part of it, because then when race is brought into a question, and I think the way Lisa put it, like the way Asia put it, these things are coming from like a systemic level. These things are coming from the bottom down, and they were created to uphold white supremacy. And yet these narratives that we see, in media, as far as the way that race comes into play, then when you bring it up in reality, people are like, oh my God, you have to make it a race thing. Well, it is a race thing. This is a system that's been, created on the back of specific racial dynamics. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, listen, Asia, let's talk about mugshots. There's a long history of mugshots, being used in reporting specifically to maybe shake up people that live in the community. Can we talk about, mugshots and how ethical they are? I know that you've had opinions on this.
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking me personally whether or not I think they're ethical, I think that a lot of times in the way that they're used is not, but I think that a lot of things that are standard in journalism practice today are not ethical. Just like the idea about like objectivity in journalism, that's not a real thing. Like we talk about it, but it's a construct to uphold a white cis male view of the world is what objectivity is for, right? So mugshots, I could see like if, the general public needed to be made aware of someone who is like extremely violent and like running the streets and there's a threat, but we know that that's not why they're used. Like mugshots is just one tool of many to racialize crime in our media systems. And we know that Black Americans, particularly Black men, are very overrepresented when it comes to crime. There's a study of New York City late night news shows in 2014 that showed that they were over-reporting crimes committed by Black men, and it far outpaced the actual arrest rate. So when we talk about objectivity in journalism, we have to kind of admit that we're bullshitting ourselves. And that's kind of one of my greatest frustrations in independent media, is because when I report from this viewpoint of challenging these constructs, right, I'm told I'm not being objective, and it's kind of gaslighty. This whole conversation, there's about copaganda and propaganda, there's gaslighting elements all around it, but it's like that system is in place to uphold this structure. And it sounds kind of conspiratorial at times, but it's not conspiratorial, it's systemic, right? And mugshots are just one way of racializing crime. And we could go on a detour, but we won't, about like the tough on crime narratives that politicians then take and run with that. So there is this incestuous relationship between news and politicians as well, which we can get into, but I'm sure others want to say something about it now too.
Well, listen, let's talk about what is that relationship between police and media. Do any of y'all want to talk about like observations of like financial ties, incentives, and things like that?
I can speak on that from some personal experience.
Go for it.
I mean, let's talk about something that happened in Atlanta on like January following the Capitol riots, right? That same night in Atlanta, protesters joined in solidarity with Jacob Blake because prosecutors in Wisconsin said they weren't going to bring charges to the officer that shot him devastatingly in that way. So the same night we saw the Capitol riots, which we all know what that was, the pro-Trump siege on the Capitol, trying to, disrupt democratic process, whatnot. Literal explosive white supremacy, and our news systems couldn't identify what it was, like during real time, until Black reporters came on the next day and were like, yo, this is white supremacy, like right before your eyes. That just shows how sick our systems are, right? In Atlanta that same night, solidarity protesters get arrested, brutalized, mistreated. I know for a fact on the record that at least 2 protesters were hospitalized due to this interaction with police and sent to Grady, with Grady EMS. People who were monitoring the scanners saw that. Fast forward to city council meeting, January 11th, Chief Police Rodney Bryant, people call in protesting this. I think that DARC arranged a call in actually, and there was a great script for it, protesting this gross double standard that we're seeing APD still brutalizing peaceful protesters. Police Chief Rodney Bryant comes on the record and says that all of you who called in are misinformed, you don't know what you're talking about, and no one was hospitalized. He just straight up lied. Right, so this is why I don't talk to cops. I don't go to them for statements because they're known to lie. But most reporters don't do that because of this construct, this idea that we have that's been established about authority, right? Activists and protesters I found are they're really treated the same way that sexual assault victims are in the justice system. They're not believed. There is a great burden of being believed for activists and people on the ground. And our major newsrooms have such a stronghold of that because that's what the mass of our populations are seeing on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, to the point where, people in my own family don't believe me when I tell them what I saw with my own eyeballs because they're just being inundated day after day after day after minute with this stuff. So when it comes to the interrelationship with journalists and police, it's just what we're taught. And I think that individually, journalists, we're going to see more of this wave shifting away from that, but we're still kind of getting to that. So I hope that, I'm just making it clear, it's really a systemic issue that is taught in newsroom, that this is where you go for sources. And we're going to, hopefully see a shift away from that, the worse it gets.
All right, Nolan. Listen, when we talk about changing these things, the media usually has a lot of control over the way that people who are disengaged from the political process think about these issues. The last year, I think prison reform and police reform took a lot of mind space over the fall, after the protests stopped being covered in the media, and the media started covering hey, police reform. But living here, we did not see those reform packages pass. Can you talk about the reform narrative, its persistence, how it resurfaces, that kind of stuff? Because I feel like we're kind of in the same place now in a lot of ways that we were years ago.
Yeah. I would say that, Angela Davis, I don't think you can have a conversation about policing in prisons without mentioning Angela Davis and the way that she's really birthed so much of this, along with several other Black women in films. But, she says that the history of the prison, and I think she would be all right with expanding that to also the history of police is reform. In the South, at least, it was a reform of slave patrols that became police. And so the history of prisons, the history of policing is reform, that comes right from Angela Davis. And I would say that the reform narrative is both made possible by copaganda and it produces copaganda. So it's kind of where we're at now. It's a little bit of both and it's made possible through the copaganda narratives that we've already talked about. But it's this idea that police are heroes who risk their lives, put themselves in harm's way, protect the public. And then when cops do what cops do and they protect property or the hierarchical order of society, whiteness, the institutions that perpetuate inequities, reformists come along and say, well, cops are just not doing what cops are supposed to do. These cops are not doing what cops are meant to do. Cops are meant to serve and protect. And so the reform narrative just gets it wrong about the whole history of policing, where policing has come from, and what it's always been meant to do. So I'll give you an example of this. So when the protests started over the summer, Campaign Zero put out this 8 Can't Wait campaign where they had these 8 policies that they say could guarantee 0 police killings every year. I skimmed the research. I shared it. And I believe them because they espouse to be abolitionists, and that can be a different conversation about professional activists like DeRay who espouse to be abolitionists and put out things like 8 Can't Wait. But I believed it. I shared it. And then 2 people DM me. One of them was an abolitionist and one of them was a cop. And believe it or not, they both said the same thing. They both said the same thing to me. And that is that cops can get around any of those 8 policies when they want to. And that none of those would work. Now, the cop was saying it because he was saying it so that reform would never happen or defund abolition would never happen. And this abolitionist was saying it because she knew that that's how cops always operate. So I took it down, did better research, etc. But these reform narratives come alongside, and they really try and take the wind out of these larger movements of people.
Deja, what percentage of people will stop inviting you to parties if you start talking about reform narratives, over between rounds of apples to apples, and you're you take a sip of your drink and you go, listen, you like Bosch, you're messing up society, man. These reform narratives, how do we communicate maybe these points, and we communicate this damage without making normal people think that we just have a weird axe to grind? Well, I believe in just starting conversations with cops because cops is so funny that everybody immediately knows how ridiculous.
It's funny because I definitely bring up abolition too often at parties.
You're that part. You and Nolan are off at the end of the party, making your own party. I love that.
Get out, yeah.
We could have our own party.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
love it.
Yeah, thinking about how to have these conversations with people, and I excited for this panel today. Made a few TikToks today talking about policing and media, and kind of plugging, hey, check this out later tonight. And immediately I got a lot of comments that were like, well, does that mean I have to stop watching it? What does this mean to me? What do I have to do about this? Because there's a guilt that people feel or a defensiveness. And I feel like a good way to talk about it is with empathy, repetition, and justice. Again, the way that these episodes are set up, very early on, it tends to show you the crime in a way that's not technically necessary to the plot, but is baked into the form. So it shows you the crime happening and you immediately empathize with that person. And then it only, within the narrative, gives you one solution, and that is policing. And it only gives you one good outcome, and that is disappearing the problem through prisons, which really they're disappearing people. You're not wrong for feeling that empathy, but should they be giving you only that narrative for what to do about that? Right. As far as the repetition, it's the same thing over and over again in a way that ends up being cathartic. I bring up some of those, 17 plots that I wrote out, which, there's ones like wrongful conviction, but there's also always an episode with a psychic for some reason. And there's always an episode with diplomatic immunity. Repetition is cathartic, but that also makes it effective propaganda. And you have to start questioning, can't I just get catharsis from a different show? Can't I start to question what's been presented to me? And finally, just justice. And the question, does it ever let you imagine justice beyond carceration and violence? And if it doesn't, then you have to do the work to try and imagine it in other ways. And just focus on, you're not wrong for feeling a want for justice. You're not wrong for responding to repetition, and you're not wrong for feeling empathy. But now you know what the show is doing, and you have kind of a responsibility to decide where you're going to go with that. And I think people respond to that a little bit easier, in part because you kind of feel like you figured out a scheme, and now you're hacking it.
Yeah. Yo, did you see Watchmen?
I have, yeah.
Did you like it? What did you think about it? Because it's a story that's the Watchmen reboot that does a lot.
I am looking over at the Watchmen poster in my room. Because it
Well,
does.
first of all, all right. Well, first of all, I don't know if did there need to even be a new Watchmen series.
I mean, I don't think the movie was great, so I think we're better off with the series for sure.
Sure.
What I'll say is that you can definitely view Watchmen two ways, because like a lot of shows, even if they acknowledge a sort of darkness within the police, when your main character is a police officer, there's a
certain narrative buy-in, yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think the way that Watchmen depicts the police, to me, I was like, oh, this is like an abolitionist dream. But then other people are like, this is terrible. And I can definitely see it both ways. I think it is trying to raise a lot of questions. And I think the value of Watchmen when it comes to media with policing is that there is such an incredible darkness to policing, and it does link it directly to a white supremacist history in a way that forces people to reckon with it and forces people to say, like, wow, she goes into this first episode, so I don't think it, maybe second, I don't think it counts as a spoiler, but, goes into this cop's, back closet and sees a Klan hood. I mean, it's evocative imagery, but it's also a show so concerned with history. There's no way to depict the police without connecting it to white supremacy. So I think, if nothing else, Watchmen is valuable in the way that we kind of need to reframe and open ourselves up to new narratives about policing. Because like Nolan said, we have these meta narratives that we run with. And anything that can introduce a new narrative that can cause us to question the more, repeated copaganda ones is valuable.
Nolan, did you see Watchmen? Did either of y'all see it?
Yeah, I watched it. I really, really appreciated Deja's take on it. Very nuanced. I just want to also suggest that, like, you could come out of Watchmen thinking that the solution to white supremacist policing is anti-racist policing.
Right.
And I just want to shout out to Audre Lorde and just suggest that perhaps the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. and so that's kind of the only extra thing that I would say about Watchmen.
My TV critic opinion about first of all, there are no necessary sequels to Watchmen. Like, that's probably the best you could do, making a sequel to Watchmen. Like if you like that world and that setting, like that's probably as good as it's gonna get. I don't know how necessary even that was, but Looking Glass was a very fascinating character, as kind of a rebuttal to the edgelords who got super into Rorschach. Looking Glass is kind of maybe in the same dark, messed up world, but maybe made better decisions than Rorschach did. I found that super interesting. And obviously all the stuff with Hooded Justice was very creative. And that and Lovecraft Country coming out within like 2.5 months of each other was kind of funny, kind of a very 2020 vibe. Asia, you've got there's a show that came out recently that you wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah, I can't weigh in on the Watchmen conversations. I haven't seen Watchmen. I'm intrigued now, though. But I wanted, we're talking about all these cop shows that already exist, right? And I just wanted to share like a recent experience. I was watching the Super Bowl with my uncle earlier this month, and I was kind of taken aback by just how much the commercials, the bombarding, the advertising, and everything. But there's a new cop show. And it's kind of funny to me. It's kind of lazy. It's on a major network. I think maybe CBS or ABC, but it's just called FBI. Like, that's it. And
are you ready?
Kind of like lazy,
yeah.
But the thing that blew my mind as this was happening, it's like I'm in the Pacific Northwest right now doing field research on the anti-fascist movement here. They launched this show literally when feds were still in Portland beating protesters, right? Like, I don't know if anyone's been following Portland since last summer and their protests there, but that's just, and they didn't even try. They just called it FBI, and it was just like and the plug was like FBI taking out bad guys on our streets in our major cities, one day at a time, or something like that, and it was crazy. And then there was a State Farm commercial like every 2 minutes, which like State Farm is part of, if anyone's watched the documentary 13th, they cover this, but State Farm is part of ALEC, which is basically a group of corporations that write pieces of legislation for Republicans to sign. that perpetuate mass incarceration. It's just crazy. We're talking about something really big. I just wanted, but there's a new show called FBI out. Didn't even try. Super lazy, but.
Yeah, there's probably gonna be like an FBI Arlington. There's gonna be like an FBI Nashville. Like all of them have like, all of these shows have like 4 absurd spinoffs featuring like people you barely recognize. Like it'll be like FBI Memphis starring MC Hammer. Like it'll be just like some name you barely remember, and senior citizens aren't gonna be watching the DARC panel and thinking about this stuff. They just eat that stuff up. You've got to, I think it's important to let the older people maybe in your life, you don't need to convert everybody. Just like remind people that what they're watching isn't real life. And they don't necessarily, like, you can educate them about, the real relationship between policing and gentrification and whatever. And you'll find that a lot of people, they've all seen the same dirty cop stories. And those people might, once you point it out to them, but you've got to point it out to them and let people kind of engage with their own critical thinking about some of these shows, because people will take things in and repeat them uncritically. I've been thinking recently, just to completely change subjects, that stuff starts at a young age. Like we have police officers in middle schools, high schools, like at every level now. And I know that when I had Karishma Mehta, who's running in Virginia, she was on one of our panels, and she talked about how when we talk about, helping teachers, part of that is not having police in schools, because it's just poisonous to the learning atmosphere. So can you guys talk about, is there a propaganda purpose to like having school officers dealing with kids that are at such a young age? Deja or Nolan, if y'all want to grab it. Okay.
I feel like you're taking like a heavy breath before you speak, Nolan.
Yeah, I mean, I think where we're at right now is that so much of our reality is already informed by propaganda and is simultaneously producing new narratives of propaganda that like keep reinforcing it. So it's to me so much of a both and, especially where we're at today. But yeah, I mean, it fits into the broader narrative that police keep us safe, that they keep your kids safe, and it's also fitting into the broader narrative that like, well, people asked this just on DARC's Instagram last week. Who's gonna keep our kids if we get police out of schools? Who's gonna stop a police shooting? And the natural question of that is, when have police ever stopped a school shooting? When have police ever stopped a school shooting? And so I think it just kind of fits into the broader narrative that police keep us safe and they'll stop something that they've never really stopped before.
Asia Arnold, chime in here.
In addition to what Nolan just said, cops in schools, which has created the school to prison pipeline, really came out of the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954, which, we haven't talked about what we're taught in public schools and like the whitewashing of history and really omitting a lot of things out of, American history, but that is one of them, and our media has, whenever we think about the Brown v. Board of Education decision, we think about desegregating schools, but again, it goes back to that stronghold of upholding a white power structure, because cops were put in place to police integrated schools, and Black students were suspended and had interactions with police at far higher rates and than white students. And that, the needle hasn't really moved on that at all. But just something to note about public opinion regarding, where cops in schools came from. Well,
the next iteration of that was during the war on drugs, and it was the DARE program, right? Yeah. And this program that came alongside Reagan's war on drugs. Yeah. And I mean, it was the next step in the backlash or the white lash to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and
Deja, you remember watching like Saturday morning cartoons, and they would have like those anti-drug infomercials, the public service announcements. Dare to say no.
It's interesting because even as this conversation has started, I'm remembering the sorts of programs and things they would set up in my high school to tell you, don't do drugs. And what I specifically remember more clearly than anything was some campaign they had, and they were giving shirts for it in a very DARE fashion and showing us, little videos about how, to be tough on drugs in our own lives. And this kid in my class, I grew up in an area that was mostly white. This kid in my class had been caught with drugs by one of the school officers like that week. And they gave him one of the shirts to wear to be like a poster boy for like a reformed kid. And he had a court date and everything. And at that court date, I remember them talking about like, it doesn't really matter. They always let us go. So the white kids I went to school with, they knew, I could get caught with anything, even by these school cops, even like out on school grounds. And then I might have a court date, but they'll just let it go. And then they'll give me a nice shirt to wear to say that I'm some reformed kid who didn't do anything wrong, and that'll be fine. And then I think about the narratives that went around about Black kids who may have done the same things or less. And those were entirely different stories. So I definitely think, that excellent segue from Nolan from, cops in schools to the DARE program and being tough on drugs, who it's actually tough on, is just really poignant.
Asia, you want to chime in there?
Just to emphasize, like the war on drugs era, the Reagan era was the media played such a massive role that we haven't seen any reparations or amends made for the damage caused, particularly to Black women during that whole era with it's painful to talk about because it's weird to talk, so it's such bullshit, over-reporting on quote-unquote crack babies, for example, which did so much irreparable damage to the public opinion towards Black women in our country, based on scientific misinformation that should not have been reported, and the way it was reported on such a large scale. And the Reagan administration saying just say no to this drug problems instead of, really getting into communities to remove the systemic issues in those communities that are, perpetuating drug use. It's a lot of what we talk about today when we talk about recovery over reform, abolition over reform, and things like that.
Yeah, listen, I feel like watching this for an hour, you become like, I guess we can talk a little bit about how do we combat propaganda. And maybe it isn't necessarily you showing this video to everybody that you know, because everybody here is talking at a high level and they've all done a lot of research and stuff. But if you are interested enough to care about this stuff, remember some of the things that have been said tonight and interject that stuff when you have a relative that maybe their thinking has just been gone way down the path and they're making a lot of logical jumps that aren't supported by reality. You don't have to make it your life's mission to stop people from watching Bosch. But I do think you have a mission. You have a mission, and you have an obligation to remind your neighbors of what the reality is like when you see that dripping into people's thinking. But Nolan, where do you think people's obligation is when you see them taking this stuff in? Where do you draw the line to jump in? What are our obligations, and what should we do from here moving forward?
I think. Early on, I talked about, or we all kind of talked about how we're human beings, understand life and reality through stories.
Sure.
And so there's if this was an evidence problem, we would have abolished the police already. If this was about, just the numbers and do police keep us safe, they would have been gone already. So the numbers, data, stuff like that doesn't work. What we do know is stories work. Being in relationship with being a part of grassroots organizations who are in relationship with people who are most impacted by policing, I think is a really great place to start. And because at that, I mean, I have so many personal stories that I, as a cis white man, would have never had unless I was involved in mutual aid efforts with unhoused people and witness the way that police terrorize unhoused people daily. I went down to check on somebody yesterday, and the police had done a sweep. Their Hope group, their homeless outreach prevention enforcement or something like that, protection enforcement, had done a sweep of a homeless camp just that day and taken all of their tents. Like, they terrorize the lives of people. So one, I would say get involved in people's lives. And then two, do the things that Deja and Aja are doing. Like, Aja is running a media organization and helping build these narratives. Deja is walking through the narratives that have already been espoused
published
in media. Yeah. And showing how they're structured to combat them. And I think all of those things are a few ways I think we move forward.
Deja, tell me about, like, as we're having this conversation, I think part of what Nolan's bringing up is we should be promoting better stories or talking about better stories. Is there anything positive that you can think about as you are somebody that mainlined all of this, no pun intended, mainlined a lot of cop content? Is there something positive that people should be maybe watching, or shows that you think have good portrayals of community safety? Or is that something that doesn't exist yet and needs to?
Yeah, I think it's more something that we need to bring into existence. I think even about Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which has its new season coming, and they're like, this is going to be good, though. Like, we listened to those protests. There's no way around.
There's no way to do it.
There's no way to do that.
I mean, Brooklyn Nine-Nine is like a very cheerful, if you've never seen it, it's like a very cheerful comedy that takes place in a fantasy world. It's just that particular setting, the show's been on for what, like 7 seasons now? It's long in the tooth anyway. And I just think that people aren't in the mood for that setting, for that kind of show.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, even
if those guys were post office workers, they'd probably still be on the air.
They could easily be on the air. Yeah, I mean, from the first episode, the main character has a bet to see how many people they can arrest in like a day or a week. So, I don't know that there's a way to have media centered around cops as the protagonist and do something redeemable. And that's why I have to, even when I say Watchmen, I think Nolan brings up the great point. Like, you can walk away from even Watchmen and be like, well, we just need anti-racist policing. So I think if we really want to see a change, it's something we're going to have to see in the future more so than something that's there. But I also like to say to people, there's so much that you can be watching right now. We are in like a golden age of television.
What should we be watching?
What
are you watching?
Right now I'm watching WandaVision, which brings its own questions. But, in like 2010, it was like 20% of all TV shows and cable TV were cop shows. And cable TV was almost the only choice you had, Netflix wasn't making original content. In 2020, it's about 20% again, which is actually an improvement because it peaked and went down. But now you can watch anything you want on a ton of streaming services. People are making web series on YouTube. You have choices, and you don't need to be taking in propaganda. That's always an option. Just don't do that.
Asia, what should people be doing? What should the average person want? What should we be taking away?
I think one of the biggest things I want to say to like ordinary folks is, believe activists, believe community organizers, and believe people on the ground. We have some stories working on Mainline, and we're kind of really putting in this practical application of a power shift where we're challenging what police Chief Ronnie Bryant, in that example I provided, what he said, and we're believing activists over his word. So that's something I think to every person just out there. to nurture independent thought of your own and question like what you're being led to believe based on this knowledge of the systemic structures in play, and believe people in your immediate communities and support mutual aid, and direct action all day long. No red tape. Like, we still don't see any fucking stimulus check from our federal government over almost 50 days into this administration. But free or mutual aid efforts like Free 99 Fridge, for example, is one of my favorites to give a shout out to, because they are directly feeding people in Atlanta communities that need food. No red tape. So that's my biggest takeaways of what to do.
Deja, plug your stuff. What do people need to do in order to stay engaged in your world?
Absolutely. Just Deja Talks TV. Looks like it's on the screen. I'd use that for TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, all of it. And besides that, I'm writing, and I should have some writing out soon and some podcast stuff, but Deja Talks TV will get you there anywhere.
Nolan, you got anything to plug?
Just DARC.
I just know you're in the streets. I don't. You're not plugging anything.
DARC, Soul Underground, Soul Below. These folks are doing some great mutual aid work through Saint Soul Art Collective. I'm connected there. That's a great place to get on the ground and do some mutual aid work. I think that Asia's right on. Mutual aid is an absolutely imperative part of this abolitionist movement. So
I want to talk to all of y'all later because y'all are all rad, and this has been just like a rad conversation. I don't know whether we solved it. When I get a panel together, I usually plan on like solving the problem and not having to ever revisit it again. But I feel like this issue will continue to exist after this panel is over. So there's lots of room for us to dig back into it and learn more. But this is like, we cover so many like serious, hard-hitting issues on these panels that it's good to like, we can laugh at Paul Blart and make fun of, him being goofy and cops being goofy and so much of this being absurd. But as long as we remember that there is like pernicious stuff underneath it, and look out for your friends, look out for your relatives, and don't them like spout stuff that has no like basis in reality. Hey, part 2 at any time. Mainlinezine.com/donate. Chip in like $5 or $6. I have a podcast too. It's Not Safe for Wonks. If you're on Twitter, you probably already are we're at NSF Wonks on Twitter. This has been great. Love you guys. And let's hang out as soon as possible. If you guys, go to the Atlanta DSA's page, we're ATL Dim Soak. What a great name. And you can see more panels and more fun stuff like this if you're seeing it for the first time. Listen, this has been great. On behalf of everybody, I'm Brandon. Thank y'all for watching. Everybody, let's get out of here. We got a lot to do tonight. We got a lot of work tonight. We don't rest around here. So say goodbye, everybody, and we'll do this again next time.
Thank you all. Good to be here.